talking.
Greetings from the Racial Justice Task Force of the Upstate New York Synod. I'm Pastor Matthew Nikoloff here with Pastor Kwame Pitts. And for the second of our Ethos videos, which deals with how the doctrine of creation is anti-racist as part of this series on how to our anti-racist catechism, Kwame and I are just going to have a conversation with one another and try to bring it down to the level of our experience and how these kinds of things not only play out in our heads but in our lives. And so, Kwame, what's up?
What's up? Hey, everyone. So, one of the things I think is really important as we're talking about how anti-racism goes across many different avenues and how it's impacted in many of our lives. One of the things that we don't, and it's sort of very prolific that Matt, you're drinking water, but think about, for example, Flint, Michigan.
Mm.
Flint, Michigan is a perfect example of what we're talking about when we talk about environmental racism. And I want to kind of start this with a quote from James Cone, which he says, "When I say that just injustice is violence, I mean that the slum environment, the structure of the slum itself, works violence against those who live within it, even if they never experience the physical harm so often attendant on the slum dwelling." Why this is so important is that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, even in 2021. We haven't left it behind. And if you think about the areas where they talk about there are high rates of COVID COVID cases. The reason why there are a lot of high places in COVID cases, if you have to look at the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods mostly that were greatly impacted are neighborhoods that are experiencing poverty, and these are normally Black and brown and red and other communities. If you look at those communities, historically, these are also the places where redlining has happened and also where the city as a whole has forgotten or ignored these communities. Coming from Chicago, for me, it's the west side of Chicago, a place full of Black, even though that those residents of the west side are trying to work toward hope, but a city which is rich in resources have largely ignored it. A city where if you go through the west side of Chicago, there are more abandoned buildings, there is more crime, and there really is more, I think, pain and suffering.
Mm.
And also in these places, there are more places where garbage is dumped. And I'm not talking about residents not caring about their environment, but I'm talking about city who conveniently can put all of the garbage and the refuge out of the way of the places where they know will be attractive to tourists. On the east side of here in Buffalo, I see the same sort of pattern. You have neighborhoods that are empty, you have plots of land that are empty, and you have places where things could grow, but they don't because of the toxicity that has happened in the community. And these are some of the zip codes where COVID has been at an all-time high. This is what we mean by environmental racism. As people of faith, we claim in our creed, in our prayers, in everything we talk about, that we care for creation. And in actuality, we don't. We don't do it because not only have we forgotten our siblings in Christ and faith simply because they are of a different nationality or culture or speak a different language, but we also forget the creation that lives around them. And so that's what James Cones is talking about. And for womanists like myself, there's a huge push into making sure that the environments that my people and others of the diaspora live in, that they're just as sparkling clean and healthy as any other place in the city. So Matt, I want you to turn it over to you.
Right on. Well, what strikes me as you're talking is how, as being made in the image of the creator, we're also meant to be co-creators and stewards, right? That's what God tells the first humans is I put you in this garden and take care of it, right? And steward it. And how, depending on our view of other human beings and how we relate them to God, will also determine how we treat our environments, how we will create and shape and steward the world around us. And so if we think that either A, we ourselves as a particular race or a particular ethnicity are the creators, We may, and we're, already holding a view like a white supremacist worldview, which might make us not such great creators, or seeking to make the world over in the image of something that is not God's love and God's grace, but our own kind of limited version of love. Not only will that impact the way that we then create our image of others in our eyes, like other folks who are not like us, we're also going to then create the environments around them, or we're going to steward them, or maybe not steward them as well, right? Because at the end of the day, if we are at the center of existence, we see ourselves as the authors of an environment or a city or a community. We will ultimately do it in our own best interest, which is why for me the idea of creation is so important, because it reminds us like that the author is not us, right? That the For me, creation as a story is less about the science and it's more about the story. It's
Right.
less about the how and more about the who. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? We Lutherans love Bonhoeffer because he stood up to Hitler and all that stuff. But he started a lot of his anti-Hitler theology using creation, trying to say, look, in the midst of this very much white supremacist society that I'm living in, where mainly the progressive liberal Christians are helping to kind of support the this new theology. The first thing that they tried to do is mythologize the creation. Oh, it's just this story about God loves people, and so we can also love people, right? They basically said it doesn't really matter the who, it just matters the how. And what they ended up doing, right, is then they assumed that they could be as good of creators as God, but what they really did is they used their own prejudices, their own self interests, their own agendas to create Germany. And one of the ways that they did that, right, was by eliminating the unsavory, the folks that they didn't want around, right? In this case, the Jewish folks, who also represented the story of a people who did not create themselves, a story of a people whose identity and belovedness was given to them by a creator, rather than people who said we will be our own creators, or we have our own kind of power to do that. And I think in some of the same ways, that's the temptation we fall into as Americans so often, as Lutherans sometimes, just as no matter what how we'd identify racially or ethnic wise, we often it's kind of what we mean by the doctrine of sin, right? That we are always seeing the world for what it can give me and my own. I become the center of the world rather than being part of a creation that is centered on God, and uh, and that usually ends up bad for everyone that's not us, and it ends up what's bad for us too, right? So we create an environment, a spiritual ecology as well as a physical ecology, which is not whole. It's not at peace. It's not full. It doesn't have everyone's thriving in mind. It really is just about me and my own, and then it becomes easy to say, well, I would help those other people if I could, but yeah, it's more important for me, right? Just think about your house or your land, and at the end of the day, right, land ownership, me having my own property, my white picket fence, my property, my private property, right?
Right. Right.
Again, not to say that we shouldn't. We do work hard for something, and you have that we should absolutely respect. It's one of the commandments, right? Don't covet,
Right.
don't steal. And when we become so focused on our own land, our own property, and our neighbor right next door is suffering,
Right.
we can justify and say, well, I would help them, but I got to take care of my own property first, rather than realizing that the mess on your neighbor's property will definitely spill into your land. And you can either prosecute them or you can try to restore them and build a relationship of stewardship and coexistence. So, I mean, even though it can seem like an abstract thing, like doctrine of creation and all these things, like we are always creating and
Right.
we're always trying to steward our environments and our life around us. Like you do it every day. I'm doing it now. You're doing it now. Like we're always co-creators. And really, what we think of as the center of the universe or the beginning of the universe is really vital. And Bonhoeffer just called that out. It's like at the end of the day, you can tell, what people's priorities are by their creation story, and,
Hmm.
and who's the author. And he tried to remind the church again and again, don't fall for this lie that you are a self-determined, self-creating being. Definitely have responsibility for yourself.
Right.
Definitely take responsibility, but you're not the origin, nor are you the
Right.
end. You're
Right.
not the one who gets to write the story. You're just a character in it.
Right. And I mean that goes back and reminding and thinking about as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the creation stories that I've heard, especially from our Aboriginal Indigenous First Nation folks. There's a tribe in Minnesota who talks about coming from the stars. Like
Mm.
their creation story is absolutely beautiful. Like they're like we're the first people because we came from the stars. And then when you go back to Genesis and think about that particular story where God is saying, let us, so there was a community involved with creating the cosmos, the universe, and us. And so when you were talking about like we are not the center point, like no, we are part of a bigger ethos. We're part of a bigger ecology. So therefore, since we're all sort of connected, no matter what we think our origin story is, we are all still connected. Think about, I think a lot of people thought that when they were born that this is how the world looked. And we forget the story that eons and eons and eons ago, there was one particular continent. And so this is why when you look at, especially as I look at our native folks, First Nations, and even going into like Southeast Asia, like there is definitely this sort of there's sort of connection in their faces and their facial features where we know. And then like thinking about how in many different places, and this is almost like a wonder or a mystery, that people of the African diaspora seem to be everywhere.
Mm.
There's a reason for that. And so we think that we're so connected, and we're so connected to the earth and to creation itself. And I think also too we have to really think about like how can we put ourselves above creation when creation was actually created before we were even thought about.
Right.
And so having thought all of that and knowing when you one of the things I think that has really just sort of absolutely astonished me and something that I recently preached about is this idea of baptism. So water is a part of creation. Water is very powerful. It's moving, it's healing. And I'm always wondering, and I'm going to continue to wonder, people who do not see the reflection of God or creator, however you identify as what God or creator is to you, that if they can't see the reflection of that divine being in everyone's faces, and they claim that they follow a particular path and they were brought into this path through water, then my feeling is those waters, those sacred waters, have dried up to where their souls are so cracked, not even the water nor sacred word can even penetrate them.
Mm, mm,
And this is what we're seeing today. We're seeing an absolute outrage over people who are complaining, why are we giving money for COVID-19 research, and why are we giving access to people to have access to the vaccine, access to be tested? Why are we pouring money into resources for communities of different cultures and language and immigration status? Why are we doing this? Why do we have to take care of them? And it's like, but you are connected to those people regardless of what you think, how your origin story started, or
mm,
what the propaganda you've been told. And so this is where the environmental racism comes in. Because of course, cities do not care about particular communities. And I don't know where you are in Rochester, if there are particular neighborhoods that you know and you have seen that have been desecrated because of the racism, the
mm,
systemic racism that a city or government can put upon a particular community or particular people, to where they are the ones experiencing all the pain, all the suffering, all the toxicity is poured into their land. Um, for me, also too, in northwestern Indiana and East Chicago, clearly I have driven through those areas where there's nothing but refineries right there on the lakefront, and it literally breaks my heart. Now, yes, I do like Lord of the Rings, but it is driving through some of the places was like driving through Mordor. If you think about driving through Mordor, that's the feeling I get because you have all these refineries, the land is stripped, and in those areas, people have health issues and stuff like that. So when they begin to complain that there's such a high rate of people of culture and of language, I don't want to say minority because there's a lot. I want to say like again, people of culture and language of immigration status, when there's such a high price for healthcare
mm.
and people complain about why we're pouring all this money and no, we shouldn't have universal health care. The reason is y'all created this mess. You created this, and therefore is our job as people of faith and people who are supposedly connected to creation, that we're supposed to care for everybody. We're responsible for everybody. Sorry, y'all created this mess. Y'all have to clean it up. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of where, as me as a womanist, that's kind of where my whole take is. We can
Yeah.
look at Flint and we can look beyond Flint. We can look at other areas, but there is a moral an ethical obligation for us to do that. And if we don't, then who are we?
Yeah. I feel like a fundamental part of our American identity story is of self creation. Right? I'm a self made person. I'm a rugged individualist. My parents were immigrants, but we dragged ourselves up by the bootstraps, right? It's a very competitive story. It's a story that somehow says we need to be on our own. And I think that's really ironic because, from a biblical perspective, it's actually the exact opposite of the creation story we have, right? Um, one interpretation of Genesis, right, is that it was brought into its final form. That 7 day creation was brought into its final, the form that we tell now. It was kind of edited and brought together while the Israelites, while the Jewish people were in Babylonian captivity, and it was crafted partly as kind of a pushback against the Babylonian creation story. It was an attempt to say like we live differently, because the creation story of the Babylonians, which was the culture that was oppressing and enslaving the Jewish people, the Babylonian creation story was one of competition and violence, right? In a nutshell, it involved, a dragon, and the creator God had to slay the dragon and then made the world out of the body of the dragon. And that's why in the Jewish story, the story that we claim as our creation story, God doesn't have to fight anyone. The creator hovers over the waters. It's more like a womb, right? The darkness is even part of the creativity. And then God just speaks and says, let there be light, and delights in the action, and then says there's more and more, and it's good. And then one of the first things God says to the people is not go conquer other people. It's make more. Let there be more. Go flourish and multiply. There's a story of abundance. And I think that's the story a story of abundance and of a tendency towards peace and towards justice. And I think that's a very different story than an empire like the Babylonians, who were founded on conquering others, right? If you
Mhm.
want to conquer others, tell a story about creation, which makes your people the heirs to the conquering God. We are the children of the abundant, creating, peace loving, delighting in, expansive, creative God, the God who calls every single person beloved. And baptism, right, is that symbol of belovedness, of Christ coming out of the waters and being called beloved as the icon of all of us. Also means that there is enough to go around, right? There's enough research and enough money for everyone to get COVID vaccines. There's enough water that nobody in Flint should be drinking bad water. There's enough resources that there shouldn't be any burnt out Rust Belt towns where there used to be factories that affect people of all races and ethnicities along class lines, right? That's a whole nother dimension to this you could get into. Um, the way that we see ourselves and how we are created will shape how we try to create the world around us, right? And how we see other people in that world. So yeah, if we are doing well off, often people say, well, I worked hard for this, right? I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. Why don't they too?
Right.
We also then see ourselves in competition, which also means if we're winning or we appear to be winning, we might see ourselves as deserving or even being really believing our own myth of our own self creation. And unfortunately, that's against the first commandment, which says, you shall have no other gods but me. It's against this idea of justification by God's faithfulness rather than by our works or by our deserving, right? I mean, these things we talk about all the time in church, like we're all made in God's image, and that God, we're justified by grace and not by the things we do. But then we turn around and live in and help to create a world that is actually based on competition and on works. And I think that it's really telling, how we tell that story about ourselves. Again, we need to make sure that we're teaching our kids how to work hard, and we need to take care of our gifts and all that stuff. But that fundamental identity of being self-made, of being pulled up by our bootstraps. We're a country of immigrants and hard workers, and we conquered, the whole country. And all these are stories we tell ourselves that continue to play themselves out, even in the regular relationships we have with one another. We're a very competitive, scarcity kind of driven country when we
Mhm.
have so much. And imagine if we were an abundance driven church where we said there really is enough for
Right.
everyone to have enough. Like when we give to one group, it doesn't diminish me. It actually makes sure that the whole ecology, right, is healthy and whole, right? Having a healthy Flint means the whole country is a better place.
Right.
Having a non-racist society, an anti-racist society, helps everyone to thrive. I think
Right.
that's what God wants when God talks about growth and goodness. That's what I always say when I preach here. Like my main kind of message is just look at creation. Let there be light. Let it be good. Let there be more. And light again, not as a black and white thing, but just as
Right.
let it be filled with the divine pleasure and delight that God created it with. Let it be what it's meant to be. Let it
Right.
know itself to be good. Let there be more. Like that is what God said first at the
Right.
beginning of creation. Those are our orders. That's kind of our mission, right? As the church, is to live that mission out. Let there be light. Let it be good. Let there be more. And I think that calls us to be people who have abundance and people who seek peace and fullness and reparation and reconciliation and restoration and good stewardship, right?
Mhm.
Not just how much we give in the plate on Sundays or whatever, but how we
Right,
steward the relationships and the environments and the land and the cityscapes and the countryscapes and the communities we live in. And it all stems back to Genesis 1, in the
right.
first commandment.
And I mean, I think also too, loving our neighbor. Loving our neighbor is not just the person next door that's here or across the street, or those who are like-minded us and go to church and believe in the same ideologies and the philosophies that we do. Loving our neighbor means loving the people that we don't even know. And
Yeah.
it all goes back so to into Acts where it talks about the beloved community, like bringing all of our resources so that no one has to be hungry, has to feel alone, has to be unprotected from when creation sometimes goes a little awry.
Mm,
No one has to suffer.
I love
So I
that.
don't know about where, as our audience, where you are as you all are watching this. But these are some of the questions I think that's just spark in your head when it comes to universal health care, when it comes to making sure everyone has clean and safe areas to live in. Environmental racism, you may have not ever heard of it, but it is a thing. And it is something that we, as people of faith who claim to follow the way, who claim to follow Christ, should also be engaged in, especially in these times. In the times of a global pandemic where resources are being strapped up from places where they need to be, because there is an abundance of places where there's access to testing, there's access to vaccines, there's access, they already have clean water, they already have clean sanitation facilities, they have all that. And then there are parts of the city where you drive through that you can't help but notice it is not the same. So where does environmental racism play out in the communities that you are in? And what can you do to bring those attentions to your faith community where you are, so that we as people of faith are actually doing what Christ calls us to do, actively loving our neighbor, even in a time when we have to be socially distanced, even in a time we have to wear our masks.
Mm.
But how can we, in some small way, it doesn't have to be grandiose, but how in the ways can you impact your community and the communities where are being which are have suffered from decades and generations of environmental racism?
Mm. And I would also add from a spiritual well, this is all spiritual, but maybe on your personal level as well. What creation story do you, your family, your church, your country, what story are we telling, and who is the God and the author in that story? What story do we learn in history class? What story do we learn about the New World, quote unquote, right? Or the 1500s and 1600s? What story do we believe, and how does that story check out against the number one commandment, which even Martin Luther said is like the key of everything? The whole point we're justified by faith is not just so we can go to heaven; it's so we can keep the first commandment, which is to have no other God but God. Well, there's one God. The second commandment is to have no other God. The first two commandments, the first two, right there. Passage
Yeah.
we learn as we go sometimes, right?
Right.
It's the number one commandment that Jesus says, like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor, right? And so those two things are connected. How we think about God, whether we let God be God or put ourselves in God's place, will impact and shape how we love our neighbors and the creation and how we structure space. So it's worth examining those things, and not just in a sense of like, where did my family go wrong, but where has my family also been created by other forces which are not God? Where's
Mhm.
my family suffered
Right.
environmental racism in our story? Why did your people leave Sweden or Italy or if they got to choose Africa or someplace, right? Or were they forced to leave, right? And
Yes.
what does our origin story tell us about whether we're living a story of abundance or scarcity, whether we're perpetuating myths of scarcity rather than the truth of abundance? Again, that family origin work, that history work, all those disciplines, all those things we love learning about, they really do have theological implications, and most importantly, they'll help us to hopefully grow closer to God, to one another, and to make the world a more abundant and beautiful place. So I
Yes.
think the two things that Kwame and I are talking are interrelated. Looking at the impact on the world, we know something is not right in the way the world is, right? It is kind of, it can seem like Mordor. It can seem like a place where it's under and what Paul said in Romans, the creation is groaning. It's
Mhm.
groaning in birth pangs.
Yes.
It is hurting, but it's also longing for the revelation of God's children to step forth, to listen to the Spirit that is still creating in our hearts, that's groaning with sighs too deep for words, and asking us to remember our Creator and then become part of the Creator's plan to co create and recreate and restore this good creation. So these are hard things to wrestle with for sure. And it can be hard to look at our own family's stories and our church's stories. But when we do, we can also hear the voice of the Spirit whispering, make it new. Let it be light. Let it be good. Let there be more.
Yeah.
So thanks for letting us. Do you have anything else to say, Kwame?
No, I was just going to say on behalf of the Anti-Racism Justice Force Task Force here in the Senate, and but on behalf of you and I, we hope that these videos are helpful and begin to have conversations. They're not by any means the answer. We can't solve things in 15 minutes, but what we can do and we hope to do is continue this conversation so that we as people of faith are able to do this work and perhaps maybe begin to break the chains that the empire
Mm,
has on our sacred, even on our sacred communities, not just in our communities alone, but even on our sacred communities, focusing on what God has called us to do.
awesome. Thanks.
Peace.